What if the part of you that thinks it is in control is actually being led by forces you cannot even see? Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am so glad you're here. Today, we are going to do something a little different. Usually, we look at the world around us, politics, culture, technology. But today, I want to look inward. I want to look at the machinery that allows you to look at the world in the first place. I want to talk about the architecture of your soul. We are diving deep into one of the most significant, difficult, and frankly, mind-bending texts in the history of psychology. We are looking at Sigmund Freud's 1923 masterpiece, The Ego and the ID. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Freud? Really? Isn't he the guy with the cigars and the obsession with mothers? And sure, pop culture has turned him into a bit of a caricature. But if you strip away the memes and really read the text, specifically the first 40 or so pages that establish his structural theory, you realize you are reading the work of a detective. A detective who isn't solving a murder, but solving the mystery of why we are the way we are. Why do you self-sabotage? Why do you feel guilty when you've done nothing wrong? Why do you feel like there is a stranger living inside your head, steering the ship? To answer that, we have to go back to 1923. At this point, Freud is shifting gears. For decades, he had been working with what he called the topographical model. Imagine a map. You have the conscious mind, what you're thinking right now, the preconscious, memories you can access, and the deep, dark unconscious. It was a geography of the mind. But Freud ran into a problem. The map didn't fit the territory anymore. He realized that conscious and unconscious weren't just places, they were qualities. And the way these qualities interacted was much more violent and complex than he originally thought. So, let's walk through this together. We are going to break down the first 3 major chunks of this book, and I promise you, by the end of this, you will never look at your own thoughts the same way again. Freud starts by throwing a wrench in the gears of philosophy. For centuries, philosophers, Descartes, for example, basically said that mental meant conscious. If you are thinking, you are aware of it. Asterisk cogito, ergo sum. Asterisk I think, therefore I am. Freud says, not so fast. He argues that consciousness is actually a very rare, fleeting thing. Think about it. Look at the room you're in. You're seeing the wall, the desk, the window. But a second later you close your eyes. That image is gone. It is no longer conscious. But is it gone from your mind? No. It's latent. It's waiting. Freud calls this the preconscious. These are ideas that are technically unconscious right now. You aren't thinking about your phone number this very second, but you could think of it instantly if I asked you to. There is no resistance. It's like a file sitting on your desktop. It's not open, but it's there. But then, Freud says, there is something else. There is the dynamic unconscious. This is the stuff that cannot become conscious, no matter how hard you try. It's not just a file on the desktop, it's a file that has been encrypted, hidden in a subfolder. And the operating system actively fights you if you try to open it. How does Freud know this exists? He knows it because of repression. In his clinical work, he would try to help patients recover a traumatic memory or a forbidden desire. And he felt a pushback. He felt a force. The patient would change the subject, or their mind would go blank, or they would get angry. That force, that resistance, proved that something was being held down. So, we have 3 terms now, the conscious, CS, the preconscious, PCS, and the unconscious, UCS. Now, here is where the detective story takes a massive twist. This is the moment Freud breaks his own model. Traditionally, Freud thought the ego, the I, the part of you that makes decisions, the part of you listening to this podcast, was the good guy. The ego was the conscious part. The ego was the rational pilot. And the unconscious was the dark, swampy reservoir of repressed desires. So the battle lines were drawn, the conscious ego versus the unconscious repressed. Simple, right? But then Freud noticed something weird in his patients. He would see a patient resisting the therapy. They were fighting him. But here's the kicker, the patient didn't know they were fighting him. The patient would say, "I really want to get better, doctor." And yet, their behavior was sabotaging the cure. They were exhibiting resistance. Freud realized something profound: if the resistance comes from the ego, which it does, because the ego is the thing that represses stuff to stay safe, and if the patient is unaware of the resistance, then that means a part of the ego itself must be unconscious. Let that sink in for a second. Up until this point, ego meant conscious. But Freud realized that the I, the self, the thing you call you, has a large chunk of itself submerged in the dark. You are not the master of your own house. You are resisting things, making decisions, and filtering reality, and you aren't even aware you're doing it. This forces Freud to abandon the old conscious versus unconscious fight. That's too simple. The real fight is between the coherent ego, which is partly conscious and partly unconscious, and the repressed, which is split off. So, if the ego isn't just the conscious pilot, what is it? And what is it fighting? This leads us into the second major movement of the text, where Freud introduces the terminology that made him famous, the ID. Freud borrows this term from a writer named George Grodek. Grodek had this terrifying idea that we don't really live our lives. Instead, we are lived by unknown, uncontrollable forces. We are just vessels for biology and instinct. Grodek called this force, das Es, the it. In English, we translate it as the ID. Freud adopts this. He says, okay, let's look at a newborn baby. A baby doesn't have an ego. A baby is just a screaming, wanting, needing ball of instinct. That is the ID. It is the great reservoir of libido, of passion, of desire. It knows no logic. It knows no time. It only knows, I want. It is governed entirely by the pleasure principle. So, how does the ego form? Freud asks us to imagine the ID like an egg. Now, imagine the surface of that egg is touching the real world. The shell, the surface, gets modified by the impact of reality. It gets calloused. It learns that I can't just scream, I have to wait. It learns to perceive. That modified surface of the ID becomes the ego. The ego is the part of the ID that has been organized by the external world. It represents the reality principle. If the ID is passion, the ego is reason and common sense. But Freud wants to make sure we don't overestimate the ego. We like to think we are in control. We like to think our reason dominates our passion. Freud says, no. He gives us one of the most famous analogies in all of psychology. He compares the ego to a rider, and the ID to a horse. Think about the dynamics there. The horse is massive. It has all the muscle, all the locomotive energy. The rider is small. The rider sits on top and holds the reins. The rider's job is to guide the horse, to tell it where to go. But what happens when the horse gets spooked? What happens when the horse sees a patch of green grass it really wants to eat? Freud writes that often the rider, having no strength of his own, is obliged to guide the horse where the horse wants to go anyway. Think about how often you do this in your own life. You want to procrastinate. That's the horse, the ID, saying, I want pleasure, I don't want work. The rider, the ego, knows you should work. But the horse is too strong. So what does the rider do? The rider rationalizes it. Well, I work better under pressure anyway. I'll just watch one more video. That is the rider pretending to guide the horse, while the horse is actually taking him for a ride. The ego creates a narrative of control to mask its own weakness. Now, this leads Freud to a really strange but fascinating point about the body. He says the ego is, first and foremost, a bodily ego. What does he mean by that? He means the ego isn't just some abstract spirit floating in your brain. It is a projection of your physical sensations. Think about the cortical homunculus, that weird drawing in anatomy textbooks where the hands and mouth are huge because we have so many nerve endings. There. Freud says the ego is like that. It's a mental map of your skin. It arises from the boundary between your physical body and the world. When you touch your own arm, you feel two things. You feel the finger touching, and you feel the arm being touched. You are both the subject and the object. That feedback loop is the birth of the I. So, we have the horse ID and the rider ego. But the story gets more complicated. Because the rider isn't just dealing with the horse. The rider is also dealing with a ghost. This brings us to the third major concept, the superego. Freud noticed something puzzling. Remember how we said the lower instincts, sex, violence, hunger, are unconscious? And we assume the higher things, morality, conscience, religion, intellect, are conscious? Freud says that's wrong. He discovered that some of the most powerful moral forces in the human mind are completely unconscious. He found that patients often had a deep, unconscious sense of guilt. They felt the need to be punished, but they didn't know why. They would stay sick, or fail at work, or destroy relationships, driven by a hidden guilt that they couldn't even feel. This means that conscience, our highest moral faculty, is just as buried in the dark as our dirtiest sexual fantasies. Where does this superego come from? This is, in my opinion, the most poignant and beautiful part of Freud's theory. It comes from loss. Freud talks about identification. He explains that when we are children, we are obsessed with our parents. We have these intense object cathexes, which is just fancy talk for investing emotional energy into a person. We want to possess them. But eventually, we have to give them up. We grow up. We realize we can't marry our mother or father. We have to separate. So, how does the ego deal with that heartbreak? How does the child deal with the loss of the parent as the sole object of their love? The ego deals with it by eating the object. Metaphorically, of course. The ego says, "You can't have the father, but you can become like the father." The ego internalizes the image of the parents. It sets them up inside itself. It builds a monument to them within the psyche. This internalized image becomes the superego, or the ego ideal. Freud says something incredibly poetic here. He says the character of the ego is a precipitate of abandoned object choices. Asterisk asterisk. Think about what that means. Your personality, who you are today, is essentially a residue. It is a collection of scars left behind by everyone you have ever loved and lost. You picked up your father's sense of humor, your mother's anxiety, your first love's taste in music. You internalized them to keep them with you. You are a walking graveyard of your past loves. And this superego, this internal monument, takes on the role of the parents. It watches you. It judges you. It stands over the ego and says, "You ought to be like this." Or, more cruelly, "You are not allowed to be like this." This is why the superego is so harsh. It retains the terrifying authority of the father from the child's perspective. It creates that categorical imperative, that stern voice in your head that says no. But here is the twist, and with Freud, there is always a twist. You would think the superego, being the seat of morality, would be best friends with the ego, reason. But it's not. Freud argues that the superego is actually deeply connected to the ID. Why? Because the superego was formed during the Oedipus complex, that early, primal time when the child's emotions were wild and passionate. The superego is born out of the ID's energy. This explains why religious fanatics or moral purists can be so violent and irrational. Their morality isn't coming from logic, it's coming from the ID. The superego dips into the same well of energy as the instincts. It fights fire with fire. So, let's look at the battlefield as Freud sees it in 1923. You are the ego. You are the poor, beleaguered rider. You are fighting a three-front war. First, you have the ID, the horse. It is demanding, impulsive, and hungry. It wants pleasure now. If you let it go wild, you'll destroy yourself. Second, you have the external world. Reality is harsh. It creates dangers. If you ignore it, you'll die. Third, you have the superego. It is the judge, the internal father, the conscience. It demands perfection. If you fail it, it punishes you with guilt and anxiety. The ego is stuck in the middle, trying to negotiate a peace treaty between a screaming baby, the ID, a cruel judge, the superego, and a brick wall, reality. Freud puts it brilliantly: the ego is a poor creature owing service to three masters and consequently menaced by three dangers. This is why life is so hard. This is why mental health is such a struggle. It's not because you're broken. It's because the system is designed for conflict. Freud also zooms out to look at society. He connects this internal structure to the history of mankind. He speculates that the superego isn't just about your parents. It's about the phylogenetic inheritance. That's a fancy way of saying ancestral memory. Freud believed that the experiences of our ancestors, the primitive man, leave a trace in our ID. He suggests that religion and morality are, in a sense, the longing for the Father, writ large. The superego is the psychological basis for God. We project this internal authority figure onto the universe. We feel religious humbleness because our ego feels small compared to the massive power of the superego/ID complex. It's a heavy concept. He's basically saying that God is a ghost of your father that lives in your unconscious mind, fueled by the energy of your primitive instincts. But let's bring it back down to earth. Why does this matter? Why are we talking about a book from 1923? It matters because it changes how we view our own agency. If you believe Freud, you have to accept that you are not fully in control. You have to accept that your conscience isn't always right. Sometimes it's just a cruel echo of the past. You have to accept that your laziness isn't a character flaw, but a powerful biological drive, the ID, that your ego is struggling to manage. It teaches us compassion. Compassion for ourselves. When you realize that your ego is just a fragile rider on a wild horse, trying to navigate a storm, you stop beating yourself up so much. You realize that the resistance you feel, the self-sabotage, the guilt, isn't evil. It's structural. It's part of the design. The unconscious isn't just a dark basement where we hide bad thoughts. It is the soil from which we grow. It is the horse that carries us. It is the ancient ghosts that guide us. Freud's message in the ego and the ID is a warning, but also a map. He's telling us, turn on the lights. He famously said, where ID was, there ego shall be. His goal wasn't to kill the ID or destroy the superego. His goal was to strengthen the rider. To give the ego a little more muscle. To help us see the horse, see the judge, and maybe, just maybe, steer the ship a little better than we did yesterday. So, the next time you feel a sudden pang of guilt, or a sudden urge to do something reckless, take a breath. Ask yourself, who is talking right now? Is it the horse? Is it the ghost of the father? Or is it you? Because the more you can distinguish those voices, the more you can actually be the rider. That is the lesson of the ego and the ID. It's dense, it's difficult, and it's profoundly human. Thank you for listening. Keep thinking, keep analyzing, and I'll see you next time.